my name is Peter Ledbrook and I'm Grails Advocate at SpringSource, a long-time Grails user and also a Grails committer. In this webinar I'm going to talk about what's new in Grails 2 and how the new features are going to make you that much more productive than you used to be. So before I start, let's have a look at what's happened in this last year. So at the beginning of the year we had Grails 1.3.7 and that's been the current production release. With Grails 1.3 we got support for plugins via the dependency DSL rather than just using install plugin. We also had the introduction of Groovy 1.7 and things like named queries and a few other improvements. We also saw more plugins being developed especially by the core team. So things like Spring Security Core, RabbitMQ plugin, Gemfire, and the Resources plugin, which as you'll see is now folded into Grails 2. And 2011 has also seen the rise of the NoSQL stores, things like Redis, MongoDB, Cassandra, React, and so on. We've also seen many companies taking up Grails. We've seen an uptick in usage, and here are just a selection of the big names currently using Grails. One of the more recent ones is Big Lots, a retail company in the US, and Netflix also use Grails for their internal applications. We've also seen a large increase in number of plugins, so consistent increase in numbers. Currently we've over 700 public Grails plugins. If you have a look at the job trends, you'll see that if you do a search for Grails, you'll see quite a good improvement there in numbers of jobs available for Grails developers. So for the rest of the webinar, I'm going to break down what's new in Grails 2 into distinct areas. I'm going to look at development environment features, when you're using the command line and the IDEs such as STS and IntelliJ. Also look at what's new on the web side of things, such as when dealing with controllers and views and Ajax, that kind of thing. Also look at the persistence layer, what's happened there with databases and the NoSQL stores, and we'll finally cover the remaining features. So let's begin with the development time stuff. One of the biggest features is this new interactive command line that we have now. Grails 1.2, 1.3 had Grails interactive mode, but it was not particularly useful for day-to-day work. Now the new interactive console is very different and will expect you to actually use this for sort of day-to-day for almost everything. This is just a quick little screenshot. I'll show you at the end a demo of using the Grails interactive console, and you'll see all sorts of new features such as the test reporting, how you can open arbitrary files from within the console, how you can execute external processes, particularly useful for when you want to interact with the underlying shell, for example Bash, and other features especially related to reloading. So this will suddenly make yourself much more productive, particularly as you get auto-completion for many of the commands, and they will run quicker on the second and subsequent runs because the JVM is warmed up. We've also seen a new test template, so the old frames-based one has gone and it's replaced with something that's easier on the eye. It's very easy to see what's passed, what's failed, and getting a good overview of the testing. If you've been looking at the Grails user guide for 1.3, you'll notice that the styling of it changed earlier this year. That styling is now available for your own project, so you can create a plugin user guide or a user guide for your application using this same template. More significantly, especially for development time, you get better error reporting. So not only can you find out where in a controller something went wrong, but if the controller invoked a service, you can find out which line in the service and also which line in the controller called that service method that failed. And you also get the source code fragments. You can see immediately what went wrong. And here you very obviously you can see a typo for the title attribute. So this makes it much easier to find out what went wrong, and where to look in the code for the underlying problem. Also, for development time, it's quite useful to know exactly what database schema has been created for your domain model, and also to query the native raw data that's in the database. So you'll be glad to know that the new H2 in-memory database also comes with a console, a web-based console that you can use to interrogate any database. So this is particularly useful for in-memory databases because it's pretty much the only way you can access it directly. But you can use it with any JDBC compliant database. As long as you've got the JDBC connection URL, you can connect this console up to any running database. So you get the schema, you can execute SQL statements, you can insert rows, query them, delete them, pretty much anything. So it's very, very powerful. And for that reason, it's only by default available during development within the development environment. But we still also recommend that you secure it with some form of access control, perhaps Spring Security. One thing that our users have often asked for is kind of how well used are plugins, amongst other things. They always want more information about plugins. So with Grails 2, we start tracking the usage of plugins. So when you start up Grails 2, at some point you will be asked, would you like to contribute to the anonymous statistics collection, usage statistics? And then we will be able to take that information and present it in the plugin portal so that people can see how popular individual plugins are within the context of the number of Grails users. And as with any framework or any Java library, every time there's a new version, there are many dependencies which also have new versions. So the core libraries that make up Grails, Groovy, Spring Framework, and Hibernate, they're all up to new versions. Groovy has gone to 1.8. Spring will be 3.1 for the Grails 2 final release. And Hibernate has gone from 3.3 to 3.6. So there are some changes under the hood there that you may want to check the upgrade notes about that. The Tomcat plugin includes Tomcat 7 now. The advantage of this is you get access to the asynchronous servlet APIs, Servlet 3.0 asynchronous processing. So that's now available to you, and Grails itself, Grails 2, supports the async behavior. Along with the interactive console, we also have a complementary feature, which is a new form of automatic reloading. So Grails has had automatic reloading of controllers, views, and to an extent services for quite a while, but there are various things that weren't handled, and for more complex applications, some things, the automatic reloading would start to fail, and it's based on class loader hierarchy. But now with Grails 2, we have an agent that runs within the JVM and handles all the reloading. And this means that when you do Grails run app, you can modify services, and even if a controller or another service has a typed reference to that service, the reloading will work. But you can also modified domain classes, they'll be reloaded, and everything under src/groovy and src java, including Java classes, will also be reloaded. So it's a very powerful feature. So there will be even fewer occasions where you will need to restart the server. Now that's all enabled automatically if you do Grails run app, but you can also have that available for any command just by adding a command line argument -reloading. It's also automatically enabled for that interactive mode I mentioned at the beginning, and whenever you're running integration tests. So, one of the last things in the development area are what we call binary plugins. So at the moment, when you publish a plugin, it is packaged up as a zip file. The source files are included in the zip, and that is deployed to the central Grails plugin repository or some other repository that you've set up. And then when somebody installs it, it's unpacked and the plugin source is compiled along with the application source. So this has advantages in that you can modify that source in place if you need to fix something, although that's not necessarily recommended. But you also don't run into any binary compatibilities because everything is compiled at once. However, there are instances where this doesn't work so well, particularly if you need something to compile. You need a dependency to compile the plugin, but you don't want that dependency to be required by the application. So you can now package and deploy plugins as binary files, in which case they are pre-compiled. Views are pre-compiled into GSPC, and the classes are all pre-compiled into class files. And they're all packaged as a jar file, which is particularly useful for Maven, which doesn't natively know about those plugin zip files, and you just declare them as standard jar files. You don't have to declare them within a separate plugin section of the dependency DSL. And also, because the source is no longer included with the plugins, it makes the commercial plugins more viable. There's that extra little step required for people to effectively steal your code, and you could add obfuscation in there as well if you wish. And it's very easy to package a plugin in binary format. There's an option for package plugin, or you can put in a extra property in the plugin descriptor which says always package this plugin as binary form. So those are all the development features. What's happening on the web front end area? Well, to begin with, we've got completely new scaffolding, which is HTML5 based. This gives you all sorts of nice features. I will demonstrate those in an example at the end. But one of the best things about the new scaffolding is it's much more representative of good practice when writing Grails applications, and it's the actual templates are a good basis for real Grails applications. You also have access to a bunch of features that Grails framework itself was using, but you as a developer didn't really have access to, but would nonetheless have been pretty useful. So for example, when creating emails, you may have wanted to use GSPs, but rendering a GSP outside of the whole controller action view mechanism was difficult. The mail plugin made it possible, but there are other occasions where you might want to use GSP template technology without having a HTTP request available. So we now have a page renderer class. It's actually a Spring Bean that you can just inject into your own controllers or services, and you can use that to render GSPs with any model. So very powerful. Use the GSP to generate HTML for sort of on the file system, emails, or whatever. Similarly, you can have always been able to generate links for web pages using the link tag, but if you want to generate it for emails or for anything else outside of a request, there wasn't really possible, and it's very difficult to get access to the reverse URL mappings. So you'd be glad to know that there's another Spring Bean of type link generator, which you can use to generate links from controller and action names outside of HTTP requests and outside of views and templates. I mentioned resources right at the beginning, so this is now it's still a plugin, but it's installed by default when you create a new Grails 2 project. So any other plugins can effectively rely on people having the resources plugin installed and managing their static resources. So that's your JavaScript files, your CSS files, and any other types of file. And one of the things that resource plugin guarantees is that you will only ever include a particular file once in a page. So it doesn't matter how many times it's effectively declared or its module is declared in partial templates and the views, it will only appear in the final HTML once. And of course, now that your resources are managed as these modules, we can add extra features such as automatic bundling of all CSS files within a single module. This reduces, of course, the number of requests required by a page. So you can still separate out your CSS or your JavaScript into multiple files, making it more manageable for development, but they will, as long as they're part of the same module, they'll automatically be bundled, so you're getting more efficient pages because you have fewer requests. And related, you have the zipped resources and cached resources plugins that also improve the handling of static resources. The caching plugin ensures that once the browser has a copy of a particular file, it won't even request it again unless it's changed. So all sorts of powerful features built in, and all you have to do is declare your resources. And with Grails 2, resources is integrated into some of the core tags. So JavaScript, for example, is resources aware, and external is a new tag that will automatically create the appropriate type of link depending on the type of the resource. So a CSS file will result in a link tag, a image will result in an IMG tag, and so on. So here's a simple example of how you declare those resources. As you can see, we have two modules, core and utils here, and you can also specify dependencies between them. So if you say you depend on the utils module within a page, within a GSP view, for example, then that will also include jQuery results. And of course, if utils depends on multiple modules, each of which depends on jQuery, jQuery will still only appear in your page once. Very important part of static resource handling. We also, if you want zipping and caching, it is a simple case of installing the corresponding plugins, zipped resources, cached resources. And we're also seeing others being developed. You get a resources aware plugin for less CSS files, which is a way of, more programmatic way of doing CSS files. And there's even more recently a CDN resources plugin, so that you can easily use a CDN for all your static resource handling. So moving on to the persistence layer. The GORM API throughout this year has been extracted. It's no longer Hibernate dependent, which means that you can use the same API for accessing multiple data stores such as MongoDB, Redis, Hibernate still, but also Cassandra and Riak. So there are several plugins being maintained by the Grails team, MongoDB and Redis for example, but also seeing contributions from the community. This also means that if you're writing a public plugin, you have to be aware that you can no longer assume that Hibernate is being used, because somebody may be using an alternative data store. So here's a quick list of the plugins that we already have. SimpleDB and Neo4j, for example, both of those community contributed. Now, on the SQL front, one of the biggest new features is something we called where queries. So here we have effectively a new DSL for doing SQL queries, but the first thing you'll notice is there's no SQL, it doesn't look like criteria queries, there's no dynamic finder's name. What it looks like is a basic Boolean expression from Groovy, and yet that is translated behind the scenes into a SQL query. So this particular example, I'm sure you can guess from the example here, will return all person instances whose first name property is equal to the string but. But what you will notice is that the results of that where are assigned to a variable, and then find is called on that variable. This is because where creates what we call a detached query. So now you can have these standalone queries that don't actually do anything until you execute a method on them. You have things like find, you also have list if you want to return all results that match the where criteria, but you can also chain it with dynamic finders, so you can add extra criteria by simply using a dynamic finder, find all by last name like such and such. One of the biggest advantages of this where query, apart from the fact that it's basically Groovy Boolean expressions and therefore very easy to understand for Groovy and Java developers, but it's also compile time checked. And what we mean by that is the property is actually checked against the class that you're querying on. So if person has rather than the first name property, it has just name, then that query will throw a compilation error because first name is not a property on person. So you get early feedback on those queries. And it's also aware of types. So first name is a string, so if you try to add a criteria first name equals 10, where 10 is an integer, you'll also get a compilation error because 10 is not a string. You cannot compare a string to an integer. And as I was saying, you have these Groovy expressions, and that means you can use all types of Groovy operator, so equals equals, not equals, less than, greater than, so you can guess what all of those mean and what they translate to in SQL. You can also chain these together using logical and logical or operators, so it's very easy to read and understand what a particular query does. And finally, these where criteria also support aggregate functions, so average, sum, max, and you also get some compile time support for those. So if you mistype one of those, it will fail, or if you mistype age on the right hand side, that will also generate a compilation error. So this is a new powerful way of querying that's particularly accessible to existing Groovy and Java developers. Now, Grails has had a multiple data sources plugin for a fair while, but now we think this is a core part of Grails applications. Many people need this support, so it's been incorporated into Grails core. So as soon as you start using Grails 2, you can start declaring multiple data sources. So your data sources are declared in datasources.groovy as normal, but they're given a different name. There's data source underscore auditing, for example, would be defined in datasources.groovy. And then you can easily map a particular domain class to a particular data source within a static mapping block like so. So you can have data source auditing. So this will ensure that whenever you're working with zip code domain instances, they'll be working against whatever data source is backing auditing. You can also specify multiple data sources. So data sources followed by a list of the data sources that you want to back zip code with. Of course, this means you have to wonder, how do you specify exactly which data source you're going to work against for any particular zip code query, or whenever you save a particular zip code. And the way you get around that is by accessing a special property on the domain class, which is named after the data source. So in this case, we have zipcode.auditing, so auditing is the name of the data source, .get42. So this will retrieve the zip code from the auditing data source. And we can use the same for finders, for save, and such like. An important part of any sort of Grails application is also migrating existing data. Now, often when people start with Grails, they use Hibernate's AutoDDL to create the database schema, and also to update it later once you've already got data. Now this is great for development, makes things very easy, but as soon as you introduce production data, things become more complicated, and really you don't want to use the AutoDDL at all. It can't handle, for example, simple things like column renames, and certainly if you need to process the data or move data between columns, Hibernate Update cannot do that. So at that point you need something more structured that you have more control over, and we've had a couple of plugins for doing this. One was called Liquibase and the other was called Autobase. But this is such an important part of Grails development that we have a new plugin that takes the two of them, the best of those two, and merges them into a whole new one that is officially supported by Spring Source. And this is the Database Migration plugin. So the way you would typically use this is that in pre-production you would have use Hibernate Update, but as soon as you go to production, the first time that you go to production, you generate a changelog from the existing domain model, and the changelog is a set of differences, a set of effectively SQL statements under the hood that describe how to build that initial schema. You can then use that changelog to initialize any empty database so that you bring it up to this first release. Then, you work on your application, the domain model may change, and if the domain model changes, then you can run another command, dbm GORM diff, and that will take your domain model, compare it against the existing database schema. So that will be whatever schema is used by the previously deployed version. That will give you a set of change logs which you can commit against the domain model changes, so that you can keep changes to the domain model together with the changes to the database schema. And then when you're ready to deploy the application, you can execute those change logs against the production database, either using dbm update command, which will access the database directly, or you can have your application automatically run the change logs on application startup, which is particularly useful if you don't have direct access to the database. A sibling of database migration is what we call the reverse engineering plugin, and the idea behind this is you may have an existing database with an existing schema and you want to be able to develop a Grails application against it, but you don't want to have to write all the domain classes from scratch, particularly if you've got 50 or more tables. So with reverse engineering you can take that schema, run a command, and it will generate a GORM domain model. So you get a starting point with which you can then fine-tune, tweak that model, but the bulk of the work is already done for you. There are also a few other changes to GORM. First one being the better support for abstract-based domain classes. So it used to be the case that if you had something like manager and employee, which both extended an abstract person class, you'd actually have two separate tables, one for employees and one for managers. Now, if a person is an abstract domain class, you'll have one table which is person, and employee and manager will use that table. Also, this version sees the introduction of two new methods, find or create where or find or save where. Now these encapsulate a common pattern that's already used in many Grails applications, particularly in the bootstrap of data. So the idea is that you query for a particular instance, for example a user instance in this case, and if that instance doesn't exist, then you create one. So it's a basic, if it exists, give it to me, if not, I'll create one and use that instead. So very common pattern, but actually the code itself is a bit clunky. So now you can use a single method to replace that block of code. So find or save where will retrieve the admin user in this case if it exists, or create a new admin user. Now the difference between create or find or create where and find or save where is that create will create the instance but not save it to the database. You will have to explicitly save it if you want it to persist, whereas save will persist it. And now the last section is about unit testing support. This has had a thorough overhaul. So pre 2.0 there was a unit testing framework. It was based on a hierarchy of domain classes, and there were various issues there. One significant one was there was a mock domain method which would allow you to set up a test domain model that you could run your code against, but it was never a full complete GORM implementation. It always lagged behind changes in GORM itself, so you'd use a new GORM feature but then your unit test would break because mock domain didn't support that particular feature. And because we were using a inheritance hierarchy, it made it difficult to use those test support classes with alternative test types which also required you to extend a class. In particular Spock. So Spock requires you to extend a specification class. And what the Spock plugin ended up doing was providing a parallel test support hierarchy based on Grails unit test case and its children. So that wasn't really an ideal solution. And on the web front, there was some support for web-related testing for the controllers and tag libraries, but it wasn't extensive, and you had to understand how the unit testing framework worked, because basically your test code didn't look like normal application code. So now with Grails 2 there are several significant changes. First and foremost, it's based on groovy mixins. So this means that all of those test support behavior that used to be in base classes and now can now be mixed into any class. So you no longer need to extend something. You don't need to extend Grails unit test case. Of course, this makes it that much easier to use the test framework with alternative testing tools such as Spock. So you can use it with JUnit4, JUnit3, 8, or Spock, or for example gmock. You can extend the gmock test cases. In addition to that, we now have this @mock annotation. So you no longer have mock domain. Instead, you mock a domain class using the annotation. Then you can use to set up test data. You just use standard GORM syntax. In this particular, for example, new person, initialize the person instance, and then save it, and that is your test data. Even better, underpinning this unit test support for domain classes is a GORM compliant implementation. And we have this thing called a GORM TCK, which ensures that a GORM implementation satisfies the GORM API. So therefore, this test implementation supports criteria queries, where queries, things that weren't supported by the previous unit test framework. And of course, every time there are enhancements to GORM, then the GORM TCK, things start failing the GORM TCK, and so you're always guaranteed that the test framework will be up to date with GORM API itself. And there is extra support for tag libraries. You can see you can test the actual output of tags. You've got built-in support for command objects. You don't have to do any special binding yourself. That's all done automatically. Same goes for XML and JSON. And all of these things, there is extra support and better support in that typically your test code now looks like standard application code. So you don't have to learn a whole new syntax just to use the unit test framework. So, with all of that, I'll now do a quick demo of the sort of basic new features in Grails 2. Starting with the interactive console. So create a very simple application called library. This will have a very simple model, as you can imagine. So make sure I'm running Grails 2. So I have an author who has a name, and the author can have multiple books. So once the application is created, I can go into it and just type Grails, and this will start the interactive console for me. The first thing I'll show is that integration with the underlying shell, bash in my case. I can very easily run any bash command using the bang operator or the exclamation mark. So for example, I can do clear, which will clear the screen. I can also do ls. And also there's auto completion on the file path, because you're often using things like mkdir, ls and such like. So I can do auto completion on Grails app, and then let's have a look in there. I can have a look at what's in controllers, like so. Nothing at the moment, but I can have a look in Grails app. There we go. So those are the bang commands. Now going to create my domain model. Create domain class. Notice auto completion on here. Going to start with author. And notice that the initial call to create domain class, there's a little bit of a wait, but now subsequent ones are very quick. There we go. There is a multi-purpose command, this called open. This can only be used from within the interactive mode, and this will allow me to open all sorts of files. In this particular case, I'm going to open application.properties, and that's going to open the properties file in my text editor. There we go. So let's have a look at author.groovy. Add my name property and the relationship to book. Has many books, like so, and also add a blank blank false constraint. And let's add the other side of the relationship. String title, static belongs to author of type author, and again simple not blank constraint. There we go. Now I can go back and I can scaffold both of these classes using the create scaffold controller command. Notice I get auto completion on domain classes for this particular command. Let's add book as well. Let's clear that. And of course I can do run app. And this will start up my embedded servlet container, so Tomcat by default. And once that's up and running, and note that on subsequent run apps, the startup will be significantly quicker as well. So let's have a quick look at the application. Here it is. There we go. That doesn't look too much different, but here we have the new HTML5 scaffolding. Let's create a new author, Neil Ferguson. And notice this has got HTML5 constraint checking. So title is a required property, so if I do create with an empty one, I get a pop-up, please fill out this field, and that is provided by the browser itself. So let's add Colossus, and let's add a new book, Empire. There we go, book list. Have a look at the author. Okay, so that's the scaffolding, and now I just quickly want to show you the reloading support. So let's add a ISBN property to a domain class. I'm actually modifying the domain class, and now if I go to home, notice that I no longer have an author because I've modified a domain class, and I've got create drop set as my DB create setting. When that change happened, the Hibernate session under the hood was recreated, and therefore my data was dropped. But notice that when I add a new book now, I have a string ISBN there. So there we go. And the scaffolding, because it's dynamic scaffolding, has picked that change up. Well, very quickly, let's stop run app. I want to show you the test reports. To do that, I'm going to quickly generate all for author. This is because the generate command generates a bunch of test classes. Well, it creates a test case with lots of existing tests for scaffolded controller. So if I run test app unit, and notice that you only get output in the console when a test fails, and you can see immediately what went wrong. One of the nice things, and notice all the coloring to make things stand out, particularly if there's a problem, that's all in red. And now we can use the multi-use open command. In this case, we have some aliases. One for test reports. We do open test report, and there here we see our new test report. So there we go, we can see the test cases that failed, and then which tests within that case passed and which failed. There we go. There's one other built-in report, which is dep report. So it's very easy to access that once you run dependency report. Okay, so that's a very quick introduction to Grails 2. I'd just like to finish off by thanking various contributors. So Grails 2 has had some significant contributions from the community, i.e. non-SpringSource VMware people. Mark Palmer, who has contributed the resources, static resource handling framework. Rob Fletcher, who contributed the HTML5 Scaffolding, Stefan Maldini, who's done a lot of work under the hood, particularly with performance improvements and adding support for methods and controller actions. Luke Daly, who has done marvelous work with the dependency management. Jonathan Perlin, that's worked on Maven integration, and Kim Betty, who provided us the unit test report, and also Lari Hotari, who has been contributing significantly on the performance side of Grails. We've also seen many pull requests on Grails core and GitHub, many requests on the user guide. We're also seeing quite a significant contribution to translations of the user guide. So we're looking at Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese, Thai, and hopefully we'll have those translations ready not long after the final Grails 2 release. I've also seen lots and lots of public plugins that have been released by non-Spring Source VMware people. And we're really making use of GitHub, so all of our projects are on GitHub now, not just the core framework, the user guide, the Grails.org website, which is itself a Grails application, the Grails Maven plugin, and many of the core plugins such as Tomcat, Hibernate, etc. are on GitHub, which makes it that much easier for people to contribute. And of course this year we'll also see, it'll be the second year of the cloud, if you like, and we're seeing support for all of these. Cloud Foundry, Heroku, CloudBees, all of those have plugins for Grails to make it easy to deploy Grails applications to those services. We have the support for Google App Engine and Amazon Beanstalk as well. And then continuing on into the future, expect a continued focus on reliability, as good a user experience as possible. That just not only having the features that make your life easier, but also having ways of finding out where problems lie, in both the code and performance and that kind of thing. And of course, also have a view to better modularization, particularly runtime modularization of Grails applications. And also you can expect to see more in the way of cloud. So if you want to find out more, then go to the Grails.org website. We have the release notes for 2.0 RC1 there. Note RC1 was the most recent release. The RC2 will arrive soon, and then the final 2.0 release will come soon after that. If you want to find out more, ask any questions, then feel free to check out the mailing list. We have the user mailing list, and there are also forums that you can ask questions on. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, there's my Twitter ID, so you can keep track of what's happening in the field of Grails. And also there's a URL to my blog on the SpringSource team blog. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll leave you with the webinar. And if you have any more questions, then feel free to go through those channels I mentioned earlier. So thank you and goodbye.